Hello guys, Tom from Photoix here, and in this video I'm going to take you through the mode dial on the Nikon D3300. Now the mode dial controls pretty much all of the shooting functions of the camera. It allows you to set different scenarios if you like, and it can be a very useful tool when you're starting out. Now if you look at the mode dial on your camera, you can see there's loads of icons around the top, and there's also some letters around this side, and you've got a few other different things as well. When you first get the camera, it'll probably be shipped in auto mode in this green one. For now, I would advise just practicing with that. Just put it in auto mode and just take a few photographs just to get a feel of the camera. But when you want to expand your photography a bit, it's a really good idea to get to know how to use this dial. So I'm going to go through each of these icons and tell you what they mean and when you might use them. And I'm also going to talk about the letters here, and I'll very quickly show you the effects and the guide mode. I'll probably do a separate video on the guide mode because it is a little bit more involved, and I want to try and keep this one quite short. So let's dive in and have a look at the mode dial. As I said, the green auto mode, that is fully automatic. It's a point and shoot mode. You put it in that, all you have to do is press the button. The camera does everything else for you. It might pop up the flash if it thinks it needs to. It will focus for you, it will focus where the camera thinks is correct, and it will set the aperture, the ISO and the shutter speed for you. Like I said, that's a really good mode just to start off when you first get the camera, just to get used to holding it and taking pictures. When you want to get slightly more control, then you can start using some of these other modes, which I'll go through now. This first one, you can see there's a circle with a, looks like a lightning bolt through it, and it's actually crossed out. All this is fully automatic mode like this green one, except the flash will not pop up. So if you're shooting somewhere and you aren't allowed to use flash, or you don't want the flash popping out by itself, you can put it in that mode and that will still be fully automatic, but it will stop the flash from firing. So that's really handy if you're in like a church or a wedding or something and you don't want to disturb people with the flash. The next one along is portrait mode. It's a picture of a woman with a hat on. As the title suggests, this is for taking portraits of people. What this mode will do is it will open up the aperture on the lens to as wide or almost as wide as it can go, and that will allow the background to be blurred out whilst the subject is still sharp, so that gives a really nice portrait effect. It will change the shutter speed to suit, and it will also adjust the ISO to make sure that the exposure is a good one. Also, what this will do, if you are shooting in JPEG, which you probably are at this point, it will change the picture style in the camera to give a more pleasing skin tone. Basically it will adjust the saturation slightly and the contrast and all this kind of thing to give a more pleasing portrait. It won't be too vivid in your face, it'll be slightly soft, and it'll make a good portrait photograph. The next one along again is a picture of a mountain, and this is landscape mode. What this will do, this will open up the aperture slightly so you get more depth of field, which means you'll get a sharper image front to back, so more will be in focus. Again, it will adjust the shutter speed to suit and the ISO, and it will also change the picture style to a more vivid picture style. It will be, the colours will be brighter, the saturation will be deeper, and it will just, the greens will be boosted and the blues will be boosted, so it will give a really good landscape feel to the pictures. This next one is child mode. What this will do is it will make the shutter speed slightly faster than the other modes will, because children often are moving quite quickly, so you want to capture that movement. So the shutter speed will be quite fast, the aperture will be adjusted to suit, and the ISO will be adjusted to suit. Again, it would also slightly change the picture style to get a more pleasing skin tone. The next one is sport mode. Again, this one will give the shutter speed the priority, so it will give quite a fast shutter speed if it can. It will adjust the aperture and the ISO again to suit. You may find in modes where shutter speed as a priority, like the child mode and the sport mode, that the ISO gets pushed up really high and your photos may go a little bit grainy, because it's trying to keep that fast shutter speed. In order to do that, it has to raise your ISO. So it's worth keeping an eye on the ISO, which you can see on the back of the camera. If it goes above 1600, then you're probably going to have some slight grain to the pictures. So if you see when you're reviewing your pictures that they're a little bit grainy, that's why. Again, with the picture style, it will probably be quite neutral for sports. It's not going to give a bias to any particular colour. It'll just be a nice neutral picture. Next one is a picture of a flower, and this is macro mode. And there's one important thing I must state now. Macro mode on a DSLR does not actually let you take macro photographs. It doesn't increase the magnification of the lens. It doesn't allow you to zoom into pictures any further than you could any other time. All this does is it sets the shutter speed, the aperture and the ISO and the picture style. Nothing more. You still need a macro lens to take a macro photograph, or a macro lens attachment or a filter. So don't think by using the standard lens that comes with the camera that you're going to get macro photographs by putting it in macro mode. You won't. It's simply just settings. With macro mode, it will give the aperture priority. It will try and give quite a narrow aperture, sort of around f8, maybe slightly lower, and that will give you bigger depth of field, so they'll be more in focus. When you're shooting macro, you're obviously up quite close, and the closer you get to a subject, the thinner the depth of focus becomes, so you need a narrow aperture to give you more depth of field. So this will change the aperture, and again it will adjust the ISO and the shutter speed to suit. You may find in this mode you need a tripod, because the shutter speed will probably end up being quite slow and you might get blurry photos due to motion blur. The next one is night portrait. What this will do is it will pop open the flash, and it will also have a reasonably slow shutter speed. It won't be terribly slow, but again you might need to brace yourself or use a tripod for this one. The flash will illuminate the subject, which will be the person, and the slightly slower shutter speed will gather in the ambient light from the background, so you'll have a nicely exposed person with a nicely exposed night background, city lights or stuff like that. So again, the ISO will be adjusted, the aperture will be adjusted, and the shutter speed will be slightly slower than you might be used to. So just bear that in mind. If you use this mode and you're getting slightly blurry photos, try a tripod or try resting on a wall or something like that, and just try to steady yourself a bit more. Well, that's it for the icon modes. You can see the next one along is effects, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But what I want to talk about now is these letters here, which is M, A, S and P. I'm going to start with P and work my way backwards, and I will explain what these do now. Okay, so P mode. This stands for programmed auto. All of these settings in here are what we call semi-automatic modes. With these you can actually adjust certain settings yourself, whereas in the icon modes the camera does it for you. Program auto mode is kind of a mix of the two. It gives you a selection of settings that you can adjust, but they're kind of like pre-programmed settings. So it's a selection of pre-programmed aperture and shutter speeds which you can select to get the desired effect that you want, and you change these by using the rear dial. So you can just scroll through those and it will give you a aperture and a set shutter speed that will give you a certain effect. It's a bit of a funny mode. I've never used it personally, and if you want to try it, go ahead, but I think there's better ways of shooting with this sort of camera. Either use the icon modes or use aperture or shutter or manual. I think P mode is, for me, it's a bit redundant, but if you want to try it, go ahead. The next one is S. This is shutter priority. So what this will do is this will allow you to select whatever shutter speed you want. So if you're shooting something fast action, you want a really fast shutter speed. If you want to introduce motion, doing a long exposure, stuff like that, you'll choose a slow shutter speed, and you change the shutter speed using the rear dial. The camera will then choose an aperture and an ISO to suit. Now there's one caveat with this. there's two different ISO modes. There's auto ISO and manual ISO. When the camera ships, the ISO will probably be in manual, which means you have to change it yourself. You can change this to auto ISO, which then means the camera will select the ISO for you, which matches whichever shutter speed and aperture you have to give the correct exposure. If you're a bit confused with all these different terms, aperture, shutter speed and ISO, go check out my other videos. I explain this in more detail, but I'm not going to explain it in this video because we'll be here all day. So in shutter priority, you choose the shutter speed and the camera will select the aperture to suit. The next one, A mode, this is aperture priority. So in this mode you select the aperture. Again, you select it with the rear dial. The camera will then select the correct shutter speed in order to give you a correctly exposed photo. Again, the ISO, depending what mode you have it in. If it's in auto, it will change the ISO. If it's not, it will keep the ISO wherever you've set it. The base ISO on this camera is 100, so if you see 100 in the rear screen, it's probably on manual ISO. Aperture priority is probably the one I use most often, because I like to select the depth of field in my images, and I'm not always too worried about shutter speed unless I'm shooting sports, and then I'll probably use shutter priority. But for pretty much everything else, I use A mode, aperture priority. If you use this mode, it's a really good idea to get to know how aperture works. I've got a separate video about aperture. I'll put a link in the description below, or you can find it on my channel, and that will explain more about how aperture works and how depth of field works. So if you're a bit confused about what to do with that mode, go check that video out. Next one is M mode, which of course is manual. And there's a massive stigma about manual. A lot of photographers will tell you you're not a photographer unless you use manual mode. Frankly, that's a load of rubbish. Anyone who tells you you have to use manual mode, just ignore them. You can use any of these modes you want. If it gets you the photo you want, that's absolutely fine. It doesn't matter what mode you use. I only really use manual mode when I'm shooting with external flash. I do this because I can then select the exposure and the flash will automatically adjust itself to suit that exposure. The only other time I use manual mode is when I'm doing really long exposures with a 10-stop filter, and I can then manually choose the aperture I want and then manually enter the shutter speed. When you're in manual mode, the camera meter on the back of the screen will show you roughly if the exposure is correct or not. The whole point of manual mode is not to follow that meter, because if you follow what that meter says, you're basically just doing what any of these other modes will do. The whole point of manual mode is that you know better than the camera does, so you put in the settings that you want, and that should be right for you. If you just line up the meter in the middle when you're in manual mode, there's absolutely no point. Just use one of the other modes, because that's exactly the same thing. Don't be scared of using manual mode, give it a try, play around with it. It's a really good way of seeing what different shutter speed and aperture combinations do, but don't be pressured into using all the time if you're not comfortable doing so. Use A or S, or if you want, use fully auto. It really does not matter, as long as you get the photos that you want. As you get more into photography and as you get a better photographer, you'll probably end up using these modes more often, and you probably won't end up using any of these at all. Now I'm going to have a quick look at the effects menu. I'm only going to run through these really quickly because they're all pretty self-explanatory, but just to show you what they are. Okay, so when you turn the mode dial into effects, you'll get the standard rear screen that you see here. And in order to go through the different effects modes, you have to use the rear scroll wheel on the camera, and when you do that, you'll see it will come up with a separate menu with all the different effects on it. The first one that we've got here is night vision. We've then got super vivid, pop, photo illustration, color sketch, toy camera effect, miniature effect, selective color, silhouette, high key, low key, HDR painting, and easy panorama. What these do is they actually add these effects to the photographs that you take as you take them. Some of them pretty obvious what they do. Selective color obviously lets you do color popping, that sort of thing. miniature effect. Gives you like a tilt shift effect like you quite often see. And just play around with these. I mean, they're quite gimmicky, you'll probably get bored of them quite quickly, but they're fun to play around with. The panorama obviously is self-explanatory, you can do nice big panoramas with that. And HDR painting, same, you'll probably get bored of them quite quickly, but they're there for you to play with. Again, the camera would be fully automatic, and it will add the effects onto the picture as you take them. So here's a very quick look at the guide mode. I'll do an in-depth video on this, so I'll just very quickly show you. This basically is a sort of a dummies guide inside the camera to do all sorts of different things. You can shoot, you can view and delete, you can retouch, and you can set the camera up. I'll just very quickly go into shoot. You've got easy operation and advanced operation. I'll go with easy. So basically in guide mode, you sort of tell the camera the sort of picture you want to take using these preset options in here. So say for example you want to use for close-ups of flowers and other small objects. This is basically the same as putting it into macro mode on the mode dial. So we'll go OK. The camera is now in close-up mode with the release set to single frame. Click OK. And it then asks you how you want to shoot. Use a viewfinder, use live view, shoot movies. We'll say use a viewfinder. So it's basically just guiding you through step by step how to take a photograph. So it's really useful for beginners. Again, the camera would be pretty much fully automatic, but it's just very helpful to have basically someone stood by your side telling you what to do, how to do it. And it's quite a good little function which I'll go into more detail on another video. Okay guys, so that is the D3300 mode dial. If you have any questions at all, please just leave them in the comments box and I'll do my best to get back to you. And I'll see you all in the next video. Cheers very much.